Hello dear viewers, I'm George from Ireland. Today is the bicentenary of John Keats's death, and here I am at John Keats's house. Not that he owned it, but he lived here for about a year before his trip to Italy, during which he died. And how apposite that I hear our feathered friends canticling overhead, since he's best known perhaps for composing Ode to a Nightingale. So John Keats was born in 1795 in a suburb of London. His father ran a livery stable mainly, as in you could pay to keep your horse there, a horse hotel, if you will. Livery, it's related to like the word delivery, or people wearing livery companies wearing uniforms and so on. But when Keats was little, his father died, so they no longer had the stables and the inn. So they strove to maintain appearances as a bourgeois family. He had several siblings. His mother remarried, but a second marriage wasn't a success, and she and his stepfather, they split up after several months, but they never divorced. Divorce was exorbitantly expensive in those days. It was considered utterly disgraceful, and it was a lengthy legal process. So they simply lived apart. So then John Keats, he grew up in these somewhat straitened circumstances, better than most others. So he at least went to school well into his teens, which is more than can be said for most people, and he had a bit of an education knocked into him by masters who were schooled in the classics. So he learned to read Latin and ancient Greek, and it's apt that he should be laid to rest almost in the very walls of ancient Rome, in Cimitero a Cattolica in Rome, because that was a city from which he drew so much of his inspiration. And his poems are replete with classical allusions to dryads and naiads and such like. But I think he bore his erudition relatively lightly for the time, because this new wave of poetry in the late 18th century and into the early 19th century was trying to be more authentic, the Romantic movement, because they thought that the Augustan poets, that previous generation of poets in English, had been too inauthentic, but overly influenced by the classics, which had been the mainstay of their education. And the trouble was that people like Alexander Pope or even Swift, they were trying to write Latin in English, if you will, whereas Keats, Shelley, Lord Byron, a few of his friends, William Blake, were trying to write something which was authentically English. They'd finally found their own voice, and not mentally translating these phrases, or even prose, having this Latin expression turning over in your mind, meaning to wonder, not writing that in English. So anyway, so Keats, he left school at 16, and he was apprenticed to an apothecary. It's like a pharmacist, but it's like in French or German or Russian, apothecary, meaning pharmacy or pharmacist. And the pharmacists were allowed to perform quite a few medical procedures. So he was involved in that world since he was just 16, assisting in operations and so on, seeing people being bled. They thought that was a panacea for almost every ill. We now know that was precisely the wrong thing to do: enfeeble the patient, raise their risk of infection and that kind of thing. Drawing humours down from the head by blistering the legs and such like. So, and learning about all sorts of drugs. Anyway, he successfully qualified as an apothecary. He could have gone up to upgrade himself to be a physician, but chose not to be. So he was living here in Hampstead. One of his neighbours was Fanny Brawn, this lady from a more well-to-do family. She was about his own age, but he really had the hots for her. His love for her was unrequited. Her family scorned him, partly because they felt he didn't have the means to support a spouse and children. He was also concerned about his stature. He was only 5'1". And so I know people were shorter in those days, but that was the height of the average woman at the time. So being a man, he felt that most women were unapproachable on account of his being decidedly short. So he became friends with the other literati, whose names I already mentioned, and the Napoleonic Wars were over. So for the first substantial period since 1793, it was safe for Britons to go to the continent. So Keats travelled off to Italy, partly because he was coughing up blood, and he knew enough about medicine to realize this was arterial blood. He'd contracted tuberculosis, which is mostly a poor man's disease. People who are malnourished, who were cold a lot of the time, living in damp conditions, in unhygienic conditions, who were already ill, had a compromised immune system, were much more susceptible to this communicable disease. So he wasn't that badly off, so perhaps surprising that he contracted it. But anyway, he knew that he was doomed. His days were numbered, and for about 2 years before his death, he was writing poems in which he mused on mortality, penning lines such as, "Now more than ever it seems rich to die, to cease upon a midnight without pain." So he travelled off to Rome with the others, and it was on this day in February 1821 that he died in that Keats Shelley house by the Spanish Steps in Rome, and he was buried in the Protestant cemetery in Rome, and Shelley died only a year and a half afterwards. So Keats, he feared he might die and fall into complete oblivion, but sometimes he fantasized that he wouldn't, writing, "I think I shall be remembered amongst the English poets after my death." At the age of 18, he'd published a volume of verses by the unimaginative title Poems by John Keats, and he gave strict instructions as what was to be etched upon his headstone. The legend would be, "Here lies a young English poet. Here lies one whose name is writ in water." His name was not to be etched onto his headstone, and indeed it was not. But it's very delighting to know that it is perhaps the most visited grave in Rome. And Shelley, as I said, he lies about 100 meters further away. So that is John Keats, and of course his is a name that echoes down the centuries, is inextricably linked to the Romantic poetic movement. Published a few hundred poems, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, and others. But he also penned some light verse, so his very innovative quill could write things which would delight children, like, "So he followed his nose to the north, he was a naughty boy was he would not quiet be," and so forth, as well as more serious works like Endymion, which again is really on a Greek classical theme. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever, it shall never pass away into nothingness, its loveliness increaseth ever," and so on. So that is a little bit about John Keats. Overhead, look overhead, amongst the blossoms, white and red, and weep no more, the young bud sleeps in the root's white core. Dry your eyes, oh dry your eyes, for I was taught in paradise, the young bud sleeps in the root's white core. Summer will come once more. I'm probably misquoting it, but there we go. I hope I haven't butchered it over much. So it's now known as obviously Keats House. There's Keats Medical Practice, there's Keats Pharmacy around here. None of those buildings had any association with him, so I'm very glad this is purchased for the nation. It's open to him. The house is that building over there where I filmed before, and one of the most famous poems was composed under a tree here, and it's believed that one of these trees is a descendant of a cutting from the original tree. This library is principally dedicated to his works and scholarship on Keats, so the library is not original. Okay, as we're very close to Hampstead Heath, this is the suburb in the county of Middlesex in those days. It's the county surrounding London, so he's very much a London poet. He spent all but perhaps the last year of his life in London, not too far from here. Grew up at Enfield for a while. He'd actually inherited a very substantial legacy, but the solicitor who's in charge of dispersing this bequest to him never let him know about it. I don't know how on earth the solicitor got away with that. So he would have lived in not quite such straitened circumstances. Perhaps Fanny Brawn would have wed him after all, but had he not been so lovelorn, then perhaps he would not have spent his life producing rather maudlin poesy, and that, of course, is what has seared him into the collective consciousness. So that's just a little bit about John Keats. Please do see my British Poesy channel, in which I declaim a few of his works. Toodle pip.